When you look at the full-size SUV sales charts, the General Motors quartet of SUVs obviously sucks the air out of the room, but worldwide, Nissan does incredibly well with their trio of SUVs. The Infiniti QX80, the Nissan Armada, and the Nissan Patrol are all incredibly closely related. They share the vast majority of the interior, and really the only difference is the exterior styling, and depending on where you are in the world, the engines that are available under the hood. Outside North America, the Nissan Patrol has a reputation very similar to the Toyota Land Cruiser for being a dependable, go-anywhere full-size SUV. In the United States, the big difference between the Infiniti and the QX80, other than the styling that we find up front, is that there are a few luxury features available in the QX80 that you cannot get in the Armada, the biggest of which for me happens to be the hydraulic suspension system that we find in the QX80. You'll find that in the Patrol worldwide and in the Infiniti, but not in the Nissan Armada. Only a few weeks ago, I was driving the Infiniti QX80, and at that time I thought to myself, in a vacuum, if this was the only full-size SUV that existed, it's a perfectly fine full-size SUV. But one of the biggest problems for the QX80 in my mind is that the Nissan Armada exists. This starts less expensive at $48,900, about the same price as a base Chevy Tahoe, but the Armada all the way on up to the top-end trim, which is $68,300, is just a better value than the GM full-size SUVs, and certainly a better value than the Infiniti QX80. And oddly enough, other than the exterior styling, which I have to say I think is more attractive on the Armada, the two vehicles are very, very similar, this and the Infiniti. We have full LED headlights up front, fog lights down below, this distinctive accent light strip, and then the bold chrome grille that we find in the rest of Nissan's lineup. They've really done a good job of adapting this style to not just their sedan lineup and their crossover lineup, but also their trucks and their SUVs. I don't find anything terribly objectionable about the way the Infiniti QX80 looks up front, but I definitely think this is more attractive. At 208.9 inches long, the Armada is just about the same length as the Infiniti QX80. We have relatively similar ground clearance, 9.1 to 9.2 inches, and relatively similar tire and wheel sizes. You can get your Armada with 18, 20 or 22-inch wheels if you prefer a really big wheel look on your next full-size SUV. In terms of competition, this is definitely shorter than the newest entries in this segment. That would be the General Motors quartet of SUVs. GM offers two different lengths of their SUVs, and that really separates the Ford and the GM SUVs from the rest of the competition, which, like this, come only in one size. It's worth noting that the Armada's wheelbase is definitely shorter than some of the competition, and this would be reasonably shorter than the competition if it didn't have bumpers that stuck out quite so far. Moving to the rear, the Armada is certainly less controversial than its ritzy Infiniti cousin. We still have a very similar bump out to the rear, but they've sharpened the lines and it doesn't look quite so rounded as the Infiniti does. But we still have this bumper back here that sticks out probably about 5 or 6 inches from the hatch itself. That's one of the reasons that this is 208.9 inches long rather than being somewhere around 202. On the inside, this is definitely smaller than something like the Tahoe and the Yukon. However, towing capacity is pretty high. We have a standard 8,500-pound tow rating and a standard hitch receiver right back here. But oddly enough, you won't find the trailer brake controller on the base model. You have to step one model up in order to get that integrated trailer brake controller that you'll find inside this model, and you have to get 2 steps up the ladder in order to get trailer sway control. That's something that I really think should be standard. Depending on your needs, the Armada's engine may either be an asset or a liability. We get more standard power, 400 horsepower and 413 pound-feet of torque than we find in most of the competition, thanks to a standard 5.6-liter V8. This is the same V8 that we find under the hood of the QX80. It's mated to a standard 7-speed automatic transmission and your choice of rear-wheel drive or four-wheel drive. The downside to this engine and transmission combination is that it gets 15 miles per gallon when equipped with four-wheel drive. That's definitely below the newer competition. On the other hand, we get a lot of power, good acceleration, and that standard 8,500-pound towing ability. You will be able to tow more in some of the competition, but the vast majority of the competition will make you pay extra to get those higher towing ratings. If you're interested in a full-size SUV that's under $50,000 and you want 8,500 pounds of towing ability, this is one of the best options around. Again, keep in mind the trailer brake controller happens in SV and above trims, trailer sway control in SL and above. I didn't initially intend for this video to be a referendum on the Infiniti QX80, but sometimes these things happen, so let's just continue down the rabbit hole. We find very similar seats up front, basically the same sort of seat frame and power seat design with two-way adjustable lumbar support, 2-position seat memory over there on the door, and a tilt telescopic steering column that is powered. As we find in some of the competition, but not all the competition, the front passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat. But rather unfortunately, none of those motions will ever include a four-way lumbar. When you jump into the second row, you'll start to notice that the dimensions of this platform are a little bit smaller than the competition. We have longer bumper overhangs than we find in some of the newer SUVs in this segment, shorter wheelbase, and a slightly narrower interior. Nissan gives us 113.3 inches of combined legroom. That's front row plus second row plus third row. That is the lowest in the full-size SUV segment at the moment. You'll find almost 10 inches more combined legroom in the Chevy Tahoe. Actually, just a hair more than 10 inches, I should say. You'll actually find a little bit more legroom, but not more width in something like the Nissan Pathfinder. Now, the reason you might want to get the Armada over the Pathfinder is for the width of the rear passenger area. So we do find a wider second row bench and a wider third row bench in here, as well as the towing ability and the V8 engine up front. The model that I'm in today is a 7-passenger Armada, so we get captain's chairs in the second row and a 3-person bench in the back. There's a very large fixed center console between the second row seats. It has a flip-up center armrest, just as you'd expect. It's very similar to a front console in most full-size SUVs, cup holders, and additional storage that pops out from the front. If you have young kids in child seats, you should know that the second row seats do not fold in the same manner as the Nissan Pathfinder. So you cannot leave a child seat latched into place in these seats like you can in that Nissan crossover and still access the third row. So if you have kids that are still in the wait zone for latch anchor attachment and you want easier access to the third row, you might want to consider that newer Pathfinder. Still, hopping into the third row is pretty easy with that tumble forward seat design. The second row seats do not slide forward and backwards. There's no way to apportion space between the second row and the third row. But legroom is still generous. Even though this is the smallest in the segment in terms of combined legroom, there's still a reasonable amount of it. I'm 6 feet tall and I have about 1.5 inches of legroom left. These rear seat headrests go really far down into the seat back. These are powered third row seats, so I can tilt them forward. There's a power recline mechanism and a power fold mechanism. I can access them via a button right over here on the armrest and back there in the cargo area. With 36.4 inches of headroom back here in the third row, this is below the Ford and the Chevy, but still acceptable for most adults. If I put my head right back there towards the headrest, my head does touch the ceiling, but sitting in a more natural upright position, I have about 1/2 inch of headroom left. This is definitely more room than we find in the Toyota Sequoia, but again, less than those bigger options in the segment. In general terms, the design of a body-on-frame SUV is not as space-efficient as a unibody crossover like the Nissan Pathfinder. And that's really obvious when we take a look at the cargo area. This is a much bigger vehicle than the Pathfinder, but we don't actually find more cargo room back here. We get 16.4 cubic feet of storage space behind the power-folding third row. Some of that's due to the body-on-frame design of the vehicle, where we have a frame right here under the passenger area. Some of that likely has to do with the particular suspension design in the Nissan Armada. This is a double wishbone front and double wishbone rear independent suspension. And then some of it has to do with the fact that this was designed for a big V8 engine to sit up front, rather than a smaller V6 only like we find in the other Nissan. In my exclusive Trunk Comfort Index, I'm going to have to give the Armada 2 out of 10 points. Loading cargo into the vehicle is tricky with a bumper that sticks out as far as the Armada's bumper does. And beyond that bumper stick out is this little sill plate here where we have the latch mechanism for the hatch and then the width of the hatch itself. It means that by the time you've put something in the vehicle and pushed it all the way forward where the hatch won't hit it, it's about a foot from the outside of the vehicle. That means it's more difficult to put larger cargo in or pull larger cargo out that has maybe slid forward on top of the third row, which is honestly going to spend most of its time folded. The power folding third row is also a little bit slow. I honestly wish it was just a power mechanism, but Nissan redeems themselves a little bit by giving us a full-size spare tire under the vehicle. On the inside, the bulk of this interior is shared with the QX80, but where things differ, I have to admit that I like the Nissan version a little bit better. We have a pretty standard-sized moonroof just over the driver and front passengers' heads. The first and second row feature height-adjustable shoulder belts and height-adjustable headrests. You can see the air vents right there for the second row and the third row. The leather upholstery features a quilting pattern in the center with perforations. These seats are both heated and ventilated. As we move on over to the front doors, we definitely find a little bit of 1990s styling still going on with this sort of gathered leather look right there on the door panels. The door panel shapes themselves are pretty similar to the Infiniti shapes, but things are really similar when we move on over to the dashboard, where we find exactly the same dash components. There's also some stitched goods going on there on the center console, and it's worth noting that the Infiniti and the Nissan both have imitation wood trim, so stepping up to the Infiniti doesn't actually buy you a real tree. The big change for 2021 in the Armada is this big touchscreen infotainment system. This is about 14 inches. It's nestled right here at the top of the dashboard, and honestly, this makes a huge difference in this interior. The inclusion of modern infotainment software and a big, large touchscreen really makes this interior look more modern than I thought just a simple change like this would do. You'll really notice the difference if you take a look at this interior versus, again, the Infiniti QX80, where it receives an older style 2-screen infotainment system from the rest of the Infiniti lineup. You actually get a little bit more screen real estate in the Infiniti technically than we find in this Armada, but this software and its positioning is quite simply better. It's also a little bit easier to interact with, I have to say. If we go to the main menu, the software feels just like the rest of Nissan's newest lineup in America. We then have a stationary portion of the screen that adjusts from a few different slides. We have 2 large knobs here to control that infotainment system, some buttons right there in the middle, 2 air vents, the controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control system. We then have this big door right here. If I press that little button and open it, we have a Qi wireless charging mat in there. In the Infiniti, this is actually wasted space. So we actually have a little bit more space by having that infotainment system where it is. USB-C and regular USB inputs. This is where they put the trailer brake controller over here on this side. We find the controller for the 4-wheel drive system right behind those USB inputs. Pretty typical console shifter right here. If I move that out of the way, you can see that we have a manual mode over to the left. Behind all of that, we have 2 large cup holders. That's also a great place to stick your bigger smartphone if you want to use the cable. Then we have the controller for the infotainment system. As we see in some of Nissan's other vehicles, you can control the infotainment system using this controller right here, or the touchscreen, or the steering wheel controls. So you have a lot of ways of interacting with that particular system. Between the front seats, we have a pretty big padded center armrest that opens to reveal a decently sized storage compartment. Over on the driver's side, we have a pretty familiar Nissan instrument cluster with 2 physical dials and then a 7-inch screen in between. This is where we find the status of the vehicle's active safety systems, a few auxiliary gauges, readouts from the infotainment system, and turn-by-turn navigation directions. The steering wheel is a round 4-spoke design with a stitched airbag cover, which is definitely a nice touch. You find the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control over here on this side. This button right here with the rings enables and disables some of the vehicle's active safety systems. We then have a dedicated voice command button and phone button, and then the infotainment controls are over here on this side. With 400 horsepower standard in the Armada, 0 to 60 acceleration is definitely good for a full-size SUV. This model went 0 to 60 in 6.3 seconds. You'll go a little bit quicker if you get the Armada with 2-wheel drive, because the added weight of this 2-speed transfer case is going to impact your 0 to 60 times. This is essentially the same as the QX80 because it's basically the same vehicle yet again. Now you will find a bit more power if you get the optional V8 engine in the General Motors SUV lineup, but most folks out there are going to be getting the 5.3, and it's not going to be quite as peppy as this vehicle, even though it does have a more modern automatic transmission. This 7-speed automatic has a really good starting ratio, but one of the reasons that we get better fuel economy in some of the GM competition or the Ford competition is a combination of their more modern fuel-saving technologies on their engines. You'll get cylinder deactivation in the GM SUVs, and then of course the 10-speed automatic transmission that is shared between the Ford and GM SUVs. You'll really notice that when towing with the Armada, because the ratios are further apart in this 7-speed automatic, and that means that there are going to be times where the transmission doesn't have quite the right ratio for you. In my 6-0 braking test, it took 130 feet for this to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That's pretty comparable with other full-size SUVs. Keep in mind that this is going to be a lot bigger, a lot heavier than something like a Pathfinder. So if you're debating between this and the Pathfinder, you really need to decide exactly how badly you need the extra towing ability of this vehicle. If you're really just going to be towing 3,000 to 4,000 pounds and you're concerned about fuel economy, ease of parking, performance, handling ability, braking distances, etc., you're probably just going to be better off with the Pathfinder. But as far as big SUVs go, the Armada has a good feel to it out on the road. The suspension design in this vehicle leads to a confident handling feel, even if the grip numbers aren't going to be as high as the average 3-row crossover. This model has the optional 22-inch wheels and tires on it, so there's obviously going to be less cushion. These are going to be a little bit better for on-road handling, but they are going to sacrifice a bit when it comes to the ride quality. When this generation of the Armada launched, or I should say the Nissan Patrol/Infiniti QX, a lot of folks really noticed the ride quality. And that's thanks to the double wishbone suspension design that we find in this model. At this time, a lot of full-size SUVs, in fact most full-size SUVs on sale in North America, still had a non-independent solid axle in the rear. And this double wishbone suspension design just makes this feel an awful lot better out on rougher roads, whether you're driving out on a gravel road like I'm on here, or you're taking your vehicle off-road, or you have a trailer connected to the rear. This suspension feels an awful lot more settled, an awful lot more polished than those other suspensions of the era. But the competition has not exactly been resting on their laurels. We of course have a fully independent suspension in the Ford Expedition, in the Lincoln Navigator, and now in the 4 GM SUVs. And if you get the upper end trims of GM's SUVs SUVs, then we get a combination adaptive air suspension and ferromagnetic suspension that's really, really cool and delivers, quite simply, the best ride quality in this segment. But those GM SUVs are going to cost you considerably more than this Armada. Keep in mind that this is going to sell at a pretty decent discount, very similar to what we see in the General Motors lineup. And in order to get those advanced suspension features in the GM SUVs, you're going to have to pay significantly more than you will for this model. Out on the paved road, ride quality is definitely well controlled, but if you're cross-shopping the top-end Armada to the top-end QX80, you will definitely notice one difference. Also, this versus top-end versions of the Nissan Patrol. You cannot get the Nissan hydraulic body control system in the Armada. That's only available in the QX80 in North America. Or, of course, if you're outside North America, in the Patrol. It's very similar to Toyota's KDSS suspension system in that it uses some cross-linked hydraulic reservoirs and hydraulic rams to basically cancel out body roll and body motions in the vehicle. Something that you'll definitely notice with most full-size SUVs is that if you start driving them harder out in your favorite winding mountain road, you're going to get a reasonable amount of tip and dive, a reasonable amount of body roll. But that is almost entirely canceled by that hydraulic body motion system. Again, you'll find that only on the Infiniti in North America. But if you're looking for a big SUV that doesn't exactly feel like a big soft SUV, you might want to take a look at that QX80 for that reason. In my cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, I measured 71 decibels in here, making this pretty similar to the rest of the full-size SUV competition. So I'm going to go ahead and give this an A when it comes to cabin noise. But when it comes to fuel economy, this definitely falls towards the bottom of the pack. Over a week of mixed driving, I've been averaging under 15 mpg, about 14 and a half. In similar driving situations, this will tend to be a little bit better than the Toyota Sequoia, but it's still going to be significantly lower than the newer entries in this segment. The twin-turbo 6 in the Ford Expedition has gotten a bit of a bad rap, but it is generally speaking going to be more fuel efficient than this. It's not going to be quite as fuel efficient as Ford might hope, but definitely more fuel efficient than this engine. Also, the 5.3 liter V8 that we find in GM's SUVs is definitely going to be more efficient, and even the 6.2 that we find in the more expensive SUVs from GM is going to be more efficient than this engine, thanks to its more modern cylinder deactivation system. And if you want the best fuel economy in this segment, you'll find that in the turbo diesel that you'll find in the GM lineup as well. If you plan on modifying your full-size SUV, there are going to be a lot of Nissan Patrol components that will fit on the Nissan Armada. And in that, guys, you might actually say that this could be direct competition to the Toyota Land Cruiser in some ways, and this is certainly going to be more fuel efficient than that Land Cruiser. Until we see the next generation Nissan Armada, widely expected for the 2024 model year, this generation is strongly focused on price and value. The 5.6-liter naturally aspirated V8 is standard. It produces 400 horsepower, which is definitely pretty healthy, and it has a relatively low sticker price of $48,900. It's easy to see why the Armada is more popular than something like the Toyota Sequoia when you take a look at the price tag. It also doesn't go quite as high as some of the other options. The Platinum 4x4 trim tops out at $68,300, and if you really want a fancier version of the Armada, there's always the Infiniti QX60, but it doesn't come with the more modern infotainment system that we find in the Armada. Now, there are rumors that we might see an emergency infotainment refresh in the Infiniti QX80, but details are really sketchy right now. Another thing to keep in mind is the standard towing ability of 8,500 pounds. That is one of the higher tow ratings in this segment, and it is standard. You don't have to check an option box in order to get it. With that out of the way, let's dive into the competition, and the first competitor has to be the Toyota Sequoia. I know a lot of folks that are cross-shopping these two models specifically, mainly because they're from Japanese brands and their perceived reliability ratings. The Sequoia starts notably more expensive, though, at $50,400. We get a little bit less power, 381 horsepower, and one less gear in the transmission. It's a 6-speed auto, not an 8-speed or a 10-speed auto like we do find in some of the newer Toyota products. Both of these SUVs are definitely getting on in years, but I think it's easy to see why the Armada outsells the Sequoia. Even though it has less legroom, the Sequoia does have 6 inches more combined legroom. The Armada actually has a more accommodating third row, and that's logically one of the reasons that you might want to buy a big SUV like this. We also have 1,100 pounds more towing ability. We have that more powerful engine, we have the extra gear, and even though the interiors are really not that far off in terms of overall age, the Nissan interior has aged significantly better than the one in the Sequoia. Over the years, Nissan has tweaked and refined the interior a bit. Toyota has tweaked a few things with the Sequoia, but I think the changes have been more effective at making the Armada feel a bit more modern. Next up, we have the Ford Expedition. For the moment, this is the towing champ in the segment with up to 9,300 pounds of towing ability. But there's a catch. The standard tow rating is 6,600 pounds. You do have to check an option box for that. And the Expedition can get fairly expensive. It's already going to start more than the Armada at $50,595, but that is only going to get you 5 seats. You see, the base version of the Expedition for 2021 has no third row. If you want the third row, that'll be $53,410. And if you want 400 horsepower, that's going to be a lot more expensive because the base engine tune is 375 horsepower from the standard twin-turbo 6-cylinder engine. On the other hand, we do have a lovely 10-speed automatic transmission in the Expedition. I love the transmission here, but the engine, I think, is just a little bit small in displacement. If you really plan on towing 9,000 pounds with your Expedition, you should know that something like the Tahoe or the Suburban or the Armada or the Sequoia is going to give you better engine braking simply because of the displacement of the engine. So if you live in a flat area, it's not going to be too big of a problem, but if you live in my kind of area where you are going up and over mountain passes, I would probably choose the larger displacement engine. Also, the Expedition gets the highest fuel economy in this segment as far as gasoline engines go at 19 miles per gallon combined for the rear-wheel drive model, but in real-world driving, it's probably going to be substantially similar to something like the Chevy Tahoe, which is going to be better than the Armada. Speaking of the Tahoe, it is a little bit less efficient than the Expedition at 18 miles per gallon combined for the 5.3-liter V8 engine, the 10-speed automatic transmission, and rear-wheel drive. This particular combination isn't as powerful as the 5.6-liter V8 that we find in the Armada, but it is more fuel efficient, and because of the 10-speed automatic transmission and the gear ratios that Chevy gives it, it's not really going to feel that far off in terms of peppiness. A 2 mile per gallon bump in fuel economy may not sound like a great deal, but that will likely save the average family out there about $300 a year in fuel cost. That's at $3 a gallon. Over the lifetime of the vehicle, it could be $3,000 to $4,000 of actual fuel savings versus the Nissan Armada. The Tahoe is a bit of a unicorn in a few different ways. It's the only vehicle in this segment to give us 3 different engine options. There's the 5.3-liter base V8 engine. It's a little bit less powerful than the one that we find in the Armada, but more fuel efficient. Now, thanks to the 10-speed automatic transmission, performance is not really going to be too far off. Then we have a 3-liter inline-6 turbo diesel, which is quite unique. This was originally designed for the Silverado line of pickup trucks and, of course, the GMC corollary, but this was the only half-ton pickup truck diesel engine that was designed for truck duty right up front, and that's why it's the only one that gives us an exhaust brake. So even though the displacement on this engine is relatively low, if you do live in a hillier area, it's actually a pretty good towing companion. If you want the most oomph, then there's a 6.2-liter V8 engine that's going to give you a bit more than 400 horsepower, better performance than we find out of the 5.6-liter engine in the Armada. But it will cost you a great deal because the Tahoe starts at $54,295, already more expensive than the Armada. If you want the diesel, that's $55,290, and if you want the 6.2-liter engine, that's over $74,000. Another unusual thing with the Tahoe is that if you choose the base version, you can delete the captain's chairs in the front row and get a 9-passenger vehicle. This is one of the only 9-passenger anythings in North America, and it's the only full-size SUV in this segment that has a front bench option. The one that used to happen in the Ford is no longer available. A little bit later this year, the Jeep Wagoneer is going to roll into dealer showrooms. However, the Wagoneer is going to be a little bit more expensive than the Armada. Well, actually, it's going to be a lot more expensive than the Armada because with the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer, Jeep is really targeting Yukon Denali and Escalade, not necessarily Armada and Sequoia. But there's another unusual entry in Jeep's lineup, the new Jeep Grand Cherokee L. Jeep is calling this a full-size SUV, but it's really somewhere between a mid-size SUV and a full-size SUV. It happens to be rear-wheel drive, and that's part of why on the outside it crosses the boundary over 200 inches, and so some people put it in the full-size category. It's a little bit narrower than the average full-size SUV, but it does have about the same kind of legroom and the same kind of cargo room capability that we find in the Armada. The Jeep Grand Cherokee L is, however, not a body-on-frame SUV. It's a unibody SUV, so some people might want to call it a crossover. I suppose in the truest sense of the word, it's one of the few crossovers left. It comes standard with a 3.6-liter V6 engine. You can optionally get the Hemi V8. But there's a catch here. even though the base price is pretty low, starting at $39,790, so a lot closer to the price range of the Nissan Pathfinder than the Nissan Armada. If you want the 5.7-liter V8, that's going to set you back $58,635, notably more than the base Armada. That's because you can only get it with four-wheel drive, and you can only get it in the top trims of the Grand Cherokee L. And any way you configure it, it's not going to be able to tow more than 7,200 pounds. On the other hand, I wouldn't be surprised if the Grand Cherokee L was the handling champ in this category. It's going to be lighter than the average body-on-frame SUV. It's going to be closer to the ground. The unibody design generally lends itself well towards handling. And without question, the Grand Cherokee L has the best looking and newest interior in this segment. Jeep is really focusing hard on their interior design with the new Grand Cherokee L, the upcoming Wagoneer, Grand Wagoneer, and of course the expected Grand Cherokee. The trouble is, it's just not the same thing because it just doesn't have that same kind of towing ability or that same kind of tow feeling that you'd find in a full-size SUV. At least for the moment, bottom lining the Armada is pretty easy. It may not have the interior of the Grand Cherokee L, it may not have the tow rating of the Expedition, or all of the options that you'll find in the Tahoe and the Yukon, but it is a really good value. 8,500 pounds of towing ability comes standard for $48,900. You get the 5.6-liter engine, it has a great sound, and it really does perform quite well. Towing with the Armada is excellent, and the revamped infotainment system changes the interior a bit more than I thought it would. My major gripe with the Armada before was the really old infotainment system that we found on the dashboard. The revised center cluster actually looks pretty good, and the infotainment system is now one of the snappier in this segment. It may not have the level of flash or the level of polish that we find in the latest Jeep products, but it is significantly less expensive. If you want a Grand Cherokee L with 7,200 pounds of towing capability, it's going to be $10,000 more than the base-equipped Armada. If you want to tow 10,000 pounds, you'll be able to do that in the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer, but they're going to be a lot more expensive. Make sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and what would you pick if you were shopping on a budget in this segment? Would you lean more towards the Sequoia? Would you lean more towards the Armada? Or would you be willing to give up some of the towing ability or obviously the third row seat in the Expedition to get something like the Ford or the Chevy? Be sure and let me know. Click that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNiles, Instagram, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you next week.